Responsible Business Forum of the World Law Group came together a year or two ago, maybe 2 years ago. We called ourselves then the CRM Forum of the World Law Group. We now have a new name this year. And the idea is that we know that we have law firms from so many different jurisdictions and so many different places in the world. And so many of them are doing really great things all over in terms of social responsibility and corporate social responsibility. Wouldn't it be nice in our practice groups when we get together in the World Law Group, instead of only hearing about, I shouldn't say only, but instead of only talking about business issues, what if we also talk about ethical issues and responsible business and learn from each other and best practices? So we started a forum, and we have occasional Zoom meetings. And when we did this, we were able to learn from each other's firms. And sure enough, a lot of the firms in the network have fantastic corporate social responsibility programs, initiatives. It can be volunteering, it can be pro bono, it can be a combination of many things, charitable giving, volunteering, goes on and on. And through this was born the idea of WLG Impact, which we've now moved into a month-long effort to say, if we take, first we thought a week, now a month. What if we have a month where in that month, at least one day, people from World Law Group firms everywhere around the world are all doing some environmental issue, practice, action, volunteer idea, project, all at the same time. And we gather it all together and we see the strength that the network has, not just in being good at giving referrals and having good business and learning about certain practice groups, but on an ethical, on a moral, on a responsible level. So we've been doing it for a few years now. It's terrific. So this time we have the benefit of holding our meeting, our session during the WLG at large. So this way we're open to more people joining us than our usual sessions. But of course, you're all welcome to join us every quarter or so when we have our meetings. And this time we're taking a special look at greenwashing, which I think is appropriate today because of its importance. And I also think it's appropriate to bring it up at a time like this when we're using it through the WLG at large, instead of just our forum, to open it up really to anyone who wants to hear it. So I think it's always important. First of all, there's a message. If you'd like to, you can rename yourself, and then we can see what firms you're on, which is always fun to see who's on and what parts of the world everyone is from. But the next thing I want to do is just to make sure we have some definitions right. We'll start a little bit, as lawyers, we have to do this. We're just going to start a little bit with definitions, okay? When we talk about greenwashing of ESG principles, maybe we should just start first and say, well, what is ESG? And that's something, of course, we all know. But just in case there's anyone on the line who's not as familiar with it, here are a couple of definitions, and everyone kind of has their own definition for this. But basically, the ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's kind of a generic term. Often it's used in capital markets for investors to say, what is the corporate behavior of a company? Is it doing good things? Is it trying to do no harm? How will its actions now affect their future financial performance? Because there could be consequences down the line later. They're basically non-financial indicators, and they look at sustainable and ethical and corporate governance issues, looking at the carbon footprint of a company, seeing if there are systems, seeing if the company can be accountable. I'm going to try to give you now just a few examples of what they might be. So in the environmental area, you might see things about pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, carbon footprint, climate change, deforestation. These are the things that you hear about will all fit into what is a company doing in the field of their environmental practices. Corporate governance, often that is just transparency. Does the company pay taxes or not? Do they political lobbying? Are they doing anything for donations? What are their policy for that? And of course, corruption, bribery. What is their diversity policy? Do they have, for public companies, are there any women on their board of directors? Are there any minorities on the board of directors? Are there any other types of groups that are represented from their community on the board of directors? And in the social space, it can be a lot of things. It can be the employees. It can also be the community they're in. Do they do anything for the community around them? How do they treat their employees? there's been a lot of talk lately about Tesla, which is so much fun. Tesla is this environmental breath gift to the world, right? They are disrupting the industry of cars. The idea of having electric cars and reducing gas emissions, et cetera, sounds amazing. So for ESG, you'd think, wow, aren't they great? On the other hand, there have been all these reports lately that they didn't do quite so well with how they treated their employees. So maybe they didn't actually get so much good marks on ESG. It gets complicated. There are a lot of parts to it. Okay. But those are the basic ground rules that I just wanted to set up. And now we get into, and let me just turn this off for you. Now we get into the question of greenwashing. So what does that mean when we have greenwashing? And by the way, just now that we have a critical mass on the phone, I can say this one. When you came on, you're all muted. If you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, we're not discouraging you at all. Just either put something in the chat box, or you can do raise your hand. There's a button here for raise your hand, and then we'll be able to see you and unmute you, and then you can join in the conversation. So greenwashing. Greenwashing is when you have some really unbased claim in the environmental area, which you maybe use as a marketing tool. You may be using it to attract investors or anything else, but it's actually not true. You're just making yourself sound a lot better than you are. Now, in the beginning, it wasn't a regulatory term. It was more like a reputational term, but it could have serious reputational risks and influences if a company is caught doing this, kind of like false advertising, okay? But now we're getting into what today really constitutes greenwashing, because it's developing, and the efforts at stopping it and the consequences of doing it are getting larger, and they're part of the community. So just the way ESG is becoming a mainstream term that everyone's talking about, at the same time, everyone is starting to talk about greenwashing. So the SEC has some guidelines now, and it talks about if you're reporting your ESG matters in a way which is misleading, and you're trying to get a better investment, you're trying to increase your market, your share price, whatever, that can have consequences. So what I'm going to do now is a little bit different way of doing it today, but I just want to shake things up a little bit for us. We have 3 great panelists with us from 3 different parts of the world, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves when they answer their first question. A little bit different than usual. I hope you guys flow with me, and I hope it's okay. So Dan, we're going to start with you, okay? The Securities and Exchange Commission of the United States, or any regulatory agency, is this where they should be? What is greenwashing about?
Thanks, Janet. So yeah, I'm Dan Smith. I head up the advertising law team at Gowling WLG. For accessibility purposes, I'll just quickly describe myself. I'm a mid-40s white British man, currently not very well shaven, wearing glasses, short brown hair. I come at this very much from the advertising law perspective. So the greenwashing that I see is where a business or brand is misleadingly overstating its green credentials in advertising. And that's advertising directed at business or consumers. It's not directed at investors. So I'm not looking at the equivalent of the SEC here. So the greenwashing that I see, it could arise where a business simply lies about its environmental performance, but it could also come up in many other potentially very much less blameworthy circumstances where reality doesn't quite match up to the impression that an advertiser is giving. So, for example, has your client accurately described an environmental initiative, but still given a misleading overall impression by using photos of its products against a background of pristine rainforest or beautiful green meadows? Has your client focused on a specific environmental benefit which is outweighed by the product's overall negative impact? So a gas guzzling pickup truck that might have recycled floor mats, but is it disproportionate to give that close attention in advertising? Have you focused on only a part of a product's life cycle? So an electric vehicle like a Tesla, it is zero emission while driving, but there are still emissions associated with manufacturing the vehicle and generating the electricity to power it. it's a bit of a minefield, and it's easy for a business to mislead as to the true environmental performance of a product or an organization, especially where, like most of us, the business hasn't reached its end goal yet, but is looking to highlight incremental improvements it's making along the way.
Do you think this is something that should be regulated? I mean, we get SEC guidelines, we see in Europe, we see in other areas, we see in Israel, all sorts of initiatives are taking place. Is this a place where regulators need to be stepping in beyond general principles of false advertising?
I think in line with principles of false advertising. So it's very difficult for a consumer to appreciate the true environmental impact of a product. So they can't see all of the substantiating data which supports that green claim. They can't see the full life cycle assessment. They can't calculate the carbon emissions. So I think absolutely there is a role to be played by regulators here in ensuring a level playing field, ensuring consumers can trust the information that they see, and ensuring that businesses who do have genuine environmental benefits to promote can get those benefits out to the public and earn the rewards that come from that without being drowned out by other businesses who are simply greenwashing.
Clara, I'm going to turn to you now, and I'm going to ask, first of all, if you agree with that, or rather, first, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Then I'm going to ask if you agree what Dan is saying. And then third, I'm going to also ask you to talk a little bit about what you see the risks of greenwashing. And I have to put something interesting here. So much of us, because we use the word greenwashing, and green is associated with nature. So we think about environmental greenwashing in ESG. But the great thing is we have Clara here, who's also going to give us a perspective, very good, about also the S. And I don't know if we call it social washing or green social washing, but I think that'll be very important for us to realize we're not only talking about environmental issues. So Clara, please.
Thank you, Janet. Hello, everyone. I'm a Brazilian white woman. I have a dark, short hair. I'm wearing a black shirt with a white collar and a blurred background. So as Dan mentioned, I do it for accessibility purposes for people with visual disabilities. So to start the very challenging questions that you presented, Janet, I think when you're talking about greenwashing, there are several new terms that are used to refer to other kinds of washing. So pink washing when you're talking about LGBTI issues, social washings when you're talking about everything related to human rights. And I think what is relevant to mention is that for many decades, companies used to mention in their social environmental reports what they were doing that was generating a positive impact to the world or to their communities. So for instance, mentioning the hospital they were supporting, the local school they were helping, and nowadays what the discussions really put into the table is, well, you should tell the world the negative impact you're generating as well. So because let us imagine a company that is supporting a local school, a local hospital, and then they have about 2,000 employees that are submitted to degradeful working conditions. So the negative impact they're generating is not proportional to the positive impact they are putting into society. So I think the main word when we're talking about the washings in general, green, social, pink, is the lack of coherence. The lack of coherence between what they're generating to the community and to the world, whereas what they're talking about in terms of positive impact. And I do agree with Dan that a certain part of greenwashing should be regulated, because when we have regulations that, well, establishes how companies should disclose to the world or to their stakeholders their positive and negative impacts. It avoids this kind of well, miscommunication, to use a less strong word. So I think this is one aspect. But when you're talking about your second question in terms of risks, I think there are three kinds of relevant risks for companies and their relationship with different profiles of stakeholders. The first one is reputational. If you're caught as a company saying that you're generating a certain positive impact and making, let us use pinkwashing as an example, you're during the month that celebrates transgenders' rights, you're talking about trans rights, and you use pink and blue, light blue as your slogan, and then you're caught with employees making transphobic practices. Well, obviously, or you're not contemplating transgender people when developing your products. So this would be pinkwashing. And you will obviously, when caught doing it, you will obviously lose a certain part of your clients, of your market share. Possibly you will lose a part of profitability. So this is one aspect, but we also have a legal risk that's very relevant, not only in terms of lawsuits filed by local authorities, because we do see, at least here in Brazil, authorities such as the Public Prosecution Office discussing if a company was complying with what they're disclosing to the market in terms of negative impacts. But also we see local NGOs filing lawsuits to discuss those issues in terms of all of the kinds of washings, especially greenwashing, with climate change and everything. And we also see discussions in the supply chain. So I think this is interesting between two companies, because let us use an example. One company that is buying products from another one, and they are positioning themselves publicly as a company compliant with social and environmental issues. And then they discovered that their supplier was saying that they were also compliant, but they were not, and they had modern slavery, and they were generating negative impacts in the environment and everything. You will probably have a lawsuit or an arbitration between them to discuss those issues. So we've been seeing a very significant increase in lawsuits and arbitration disputes in general, with multiple stakeholders discussing washings. So I think that the kinds of risks are they vary.
Thank you. And I don't want to say, I don't save the best for last, because I never do that in my own personal life, but we do have a third panelist that I do want to introduce now. And because she's a partner in my firm that I feel so strongly about, and I promise not to embarrass her, I'm going to embarrass her and ask her when she introduces herself to also mention what she's doing with the UN when she introduces herself, and then talk a bit about the enforcement that we see in Israel.
Okay, sure. So hi, everyone, and thanks, Janet, for having me on the panel. So my name is Ruth Dagan. I am a partner at Herzog, which is Janet's law firm as well. And I had the environment and climate change practice here. We work a lot with both companies that let's say are considered to be heavy on the manufacturing side and the energy production side. And on the other hand, we work a lot with innovative technology companies in the climate tech space. So we see both sides of the challenges, and I'll be discussing that in a minute. I'll also say again for accessibility purposes, and thank you, Clara, for enlightening us on this point. I learned something very important today from you. So I'll quickly describe myself. I'm a white woman. I'm not going to say how old I am. I'm leaving that to your best guess. And I'm wearing glasses. I have dark hair, and in my background, I have some photographs of icebergs and melting ice from Iceland, from my trip to Iceland. And that really connects to what I work on in relation to climate change. So for me, those photos have significant meaning. That also connects to what Janet mentioned regarding the UN, and I have actually recently been appointed as advisor to the UNFCCC, which is the Convention on Climate Change, and I've been working with them recently at COP27 on legal matters relating to the to Article 6, which is the international cooperation mechanisms geared at creating an international market for carbon credits. So I guess that in response to this discussion, Janet, do you want to pinpoint a specific issue that you want me to talk about, or should I just generally comment?
Yeah, I think I'd like to start right now just a little bit with, we're talking about the risks of greenwashing and whether there's any enforcement. And actually, I'm going to go a little bit. While you're speaking, it also occurs to me that as someone who's been advising companies in the environmental space for such a long time, you always have these environmental regulations. So when I was asking also the panelists about whether they thought the SEC should be getting into this, is there something called ESG that you think regulators should be looking at on top of the environmental regulations that many companies already have in place? But what is the extra? What are we really talking about when we say regulators are going to start regulating ESG?
Yeah, okay. So that's an excellent question, and it seems simple, but it really isn't, because I have to say that in the way I've always looked at things in my practice is that environment and climate change in terms of how corporations conduct themselves should be treated like any other issue that requires reporting, requires transparency, and requires integrity. So if we look at a publicly traded company, I would expect this company to be forthcoming with information relating to these issues and social issues as well, and any type of ESG related issue, just like I would expect it to be forthcoming in relation to information, for example, on applicability of various standards to a product that it manufactures and sells on the market. So for example, if it discovers a specific product is not compliant in full with a specific quality standard, there would be no question that this needs to be reported and that this is subject to very stringent regulations. So there should not be any question regarding any other aspect of its activities and effects. For me, that has always been something that has been a given. So in that sense, I would say that for me, the criteria would be any type of information that relates to this corporation's activity, whatever effect it may have, needs to be reported. And I guess that it's important to take into account the fact that even nowadays, before the entry into force of all, this new wave of regulation and European directives that really dive much more deeply into the concepts of ESG and due diligence and sustainability and so on. Even before that, for many years, there have been very clear criteria as to performance indicators that need to be addressed. Now, the question, I guess, is always how far the enforcement went in terms of how the regulator looked at this. I would say that today, if I look at, for example, the Israeli Securities Commission, then even if they have the same regulation, that the actual wording has not changed yet in Israel at all, they would look much more in depth and with much more scrutiny at whatever is being reported by publicly traded companies, because the regulator itself is suddenly much more aware of what's going on, and they're saying, okay, there are all these aspects, and why are they not reflected in this company's report? So they are injecting a lot more content and meaning into those same old phrases and words and requirements that have always existed. In addition to that, because of the public awareness and scrutiny, everything is becoming much more sensitized and, you know, a lot in the media and just being discussed almost on a daily basis. And of course, that increases awareness to a much greater extent than we've been seeing in past years. And I'll just mention that just yesterday, I saw a study by McKinsey that they were saying that over 80% of Gen Z consumers are treating, you know, any type of information provided by companies regarding products with a lot of suspicion and tend to choose to believe it to be untrue. Okay, so that's sort of like the incoming position that everyone needs to deal with, including the regulator, who is more and more expected to perform under these new so-called standards.
It sounds difficult for a regulator to try to get their hands around these issues completely. Dan, I know you have some slides to share with us, which can walk us through a little about enforcement in the UK. If you wouldn't mind doing that now. I could say I'm just asking you a question and you happen to show me some slides, but I don't think they'll believe us. So this was planned. The slides are definitely planned.
Okay, so let me just show you a few examples. Okay, so I will go on to slideshow. Yeah, so just looking at a few examples from the UK, and as I say, I'm coming at this very much from the advertising angle. And what we're seeing in the UK is, you know, the time was that businesses were, or some businesses at least, were burying ESG as a footnote on a rarely visited page of their websites. There were some sort of more, well, early adopters. So businesses like Unilever have been putting sustainability at the heart of their brand for some years now. It's been a matter of brand purpose for them. And we are now seeing, you know, as I say, I look at advertising, so that's the public face of a brand, and we are seeing more and more businesses putting environmental performance at the heart of their brands and at the heart of their advertising. And at the same time, we are seeing increasing action from the UK advertising regulators to restrain what they would see as misleading green claims. And even regulators like our Advertising Standards Authority, which administers the self-regulatory system here, are adopting a really tough line. So these slides I'm showing you, it's not a rogues gallery in any way. You know, these are businesses which really have a story to tell on their green initiatives, but they have been caught out by the shifting stands of the regulatory approach in the UK post the introduction of our Green Claims Code in autumn last year around the time of COP26. So, for example, here we've got Alpro. It's oat milk, it's almond milk. It has very definite environmental benefits, but in this particular ad, it made the absolute claim, good for the planet, good for you. And there were complaints about that. And when the Advertising Standards Authority looked at this, they said, no, you've gone too far with that claim. So Alpro sought to defend it on the basis that their products were better for the planet than dairy milk. But the Advertising Standards Authority treated this as a claim that the products absolutely had zero negative environmental impact at all. So they had an overall positive, or at least neutral, impact on the environment across their whole life cycle. And Alpro did have some life cycle analyses to support their products and their marketing claims, but they didn't have anything of that nature, or anything to the level required by the ASA. Similarly, and as I said, Unilever, very long history of putting sustainability at the heart of its brand, marketing Persil as tough on stains, kinder to our planet. And what they were referencing here was various environmental initiatives, including the fact that you could use Persil on a cold wash and therefore use less energy, but also a raft of other environmental stuff. And yet,
Dan, I'm just going to interrupt
Hello?
you for a second. We're seeing not a full screen, and we're still seeing the first screen on Alpro, and we're not seeing it yet as a full screen. So we all want to see the pictures.
Okay, let me come out and try again then. Okay.
Now we see the next one. Yes.
Can you see it there? It's not as professional looking, but we'll do it this way.
Okay.
So Persil, tough on stains, kinder to our planet. Again, the Advertising Standards Authority said, yes, you've shown evidence of different environmental initiatives, but what we need to see is, firstly, an indication of what you're comparing with. Kinder to our planet than what? Your own previous product or all of the competitor products? And then with that in mind, we need to see a complete life cycle analysis comparing the environmental impact of those particular products. And Persil had not intended to make that claim, and therefore they weren't able to support it to the level expected by the ASA. Then we have Innocent, so smoothie manufacturer, and they put out this TV ad which started with a very grey corporate future world in which everyone was eating beige food, and the world was declining environmentally. And then a singing otter comes along with a bright and cheery tune, and everyone starts feeling a bit more optimistic, and the world transforms into this beautiful green place where everyone's singing and drinking innocent smoothies. Again, Innocent absolutely got a story to tell about environmental initiatives that it is involved with. But here the Advertising Standards Authority said, look, the impression you've created with this ad as a whole is again that this product has zero environmental impact, and that is not the case. It's still served in single-use plastic bottles, for example. Oatly. So Oatly comparing their oat drink with milk. So Oatly had said generates 73% less carbon equivalent emissions than milk. And that was true, that was substantiated, and they were able to prove that before the Advertising Standards Authority. But they were only able to prove it for Oatly Barista Edition versus whole milk. They could show a benefit versus semi-skimmed milk and skimmed milk, but not a benefit at the same level. So the Advertising Standards Authority held them basically to the letter of what they said and said, no, this is misleading because the extent of the benefit is not accurate for all different Oatly drinks and all different dairy milks. This is a different one, so a very different thing here. Land Rover marketing its traditional petrol and diesel Land Rover. Now this attracted complaints from environmental campaigners who were really objecting at the mere fact of showing a petrol-driven vehicle in a forest with mud spatters on it. They objected to the strapline, life is so much better without restrictions. They interpreted that as meaning you can go and drive your Land Rover and to hell with the environment or any social or societal norms. And they also said, it's mud spattered, it's driving through an ecologically sensitive area, this is environmentally damaging, it's irresponsible. And irresponsible is a reason to ban an ad through our self-regulatory system. Now that complaint wouldn't even have been picked up a couple of years ago. But here it was run to a full formal ruling by the ASA. And up till the very last moment, they were going to uphold that ruling. Ultimately, they didn't, but it was very hard fought. And Land Rover successfully defended on the basis that life is so much better without restrictions was about getting out there post-COVID restrictions, which was supported by the timing of the ad. And they also pointed out that their products are used by farmers, they're used in forestry. The presence of mud spatters alone doesn't suggest that they were trashing a national park or anything like that. And then finally, HSBC. So this is from just a couple of weeks ago, and I think a lot of you will find this interesting because it picks up on the point that Clara was making earlier about focusing only on the positive or having to be transparent about both the positive and the negative. Now, cherry picking the positive, that's traditionally what we've called advertising. That is the way marketing teams approach advertising their businesses. But here the regulators are asking for something more holistic than that, even in advertising. So HSBC was promoting the sums of money that it had invested into renewable businesses. And complainants said, well, you're not talking about the amount of money, you're still investing into the fossil fuel industry and businesses powered by fossil fuels. And the Advertising Standards Authority ultimately accepted that and said, this ad is giving a misleading impression because it's not placed in that wider context. Now, I think there was a way to tell this story about what HSBC is as an organization, its focus moving forward, that it's helping businesses to transition. This is what it's already investing in renewables, etc. So there is a way to tell that story, but it has to embrace some of the negative as well as the positive. Yeah, so those were my few slides demonstrating the harshness, I suppose, in some ways of the UK approach.
That was great. That was also a lot of fun to see. Thank you very much. I'm going to pivot for a minute completely to a question I'm going to ask all our panelists. I'm assuming it's going to be a very quick pivot, and then we're going to get back to other things. When you hear the question, you'll understand why. Now I'm going to ask each of you if in your own jurisdictions, law firms have any extra regulations or reporting requirements, and should law firms have any sort of ethical codes of conduct when it comes to greenwashing? Now, you can see why I think this is going to be a pretty quick round. Clara, why don't we start with you?
Sure, Janet. So here in Brazil, we do have a very strong regulation for law firms and lawyers in general. And it's interesting in terms of social positive impact. And obviously, I'm always talking about with a focus in human rights and social aspects because this is my practice. But one of the interesting aspects in terms of social initiatives of law firms is that Brazil used to have a prohibition to do pro bono work for law firms and lawyers in general. This was until 2015. So, well, less than 10 years now. And nowadays, and until between 2002 and 2015, just the state of São Paulo had a regulation authorizing law firms to do pro bono, but they required law firms to send them the description of each and every pro bono work that you provided, because they needed to look into it and see if you were not using pro bono for marketing purposes. So this was very interesting, and obviously since 2015, this regulation ceased to exist, and nowadays law firms are authorized to do pro bono work. But they cannot use it for marketing purposes. So it is still regulated. About your question about the necessity of law firms having internal codes of conduct in terms of greenwashing, I think law firms have two relevant roles. The first one, as a firm. So we need to look into our practices and see if we are being coherent between what we are preaching to our clients and what we are doing internally. So I think this is one aspect of our role with the discussions on greenwashing. And the second aspect is helping our clients look into those issues. And then I think when a client has a greenwashing practice, our role is not to cease from providing assistance to the client, is helping them not do those practices anymore. So, well, this would be it.
Okay, Ruth, what do you think?
Yeah, okay. So in Israel, I have to say that first of all, historically there have been severe restrictions on advertising for the legal profession in general. And those are sort of dissipated over the years and become more lenient and flexible, but restrictions still do exist, and everything is quite formal. You won't see any type of just general open-ended advertising for law firms in Israel. That's one. Secondly, regarding specific anything related to practices on, for example, diversity and labor conditions and so on. So there are very, very strict labor laws in Israel. They are very extensive and very specific, and a lot of case law on this. So just, for law firms of a certain size, which includes Herzog as well, we would fall under those requirements in any event as an employer in the market. And we strictly adhere to that just for those simple reasons. There are no specific requirements on guidelines on those issues for law firms. And just in general, to what Clara mentioned regarding our views as to what our role would be. So again, I guess I would agree, we would definitely not be in a situation where we would not assist a client with such practices. And that really goes to my previous words about my general approach. This should be treated just like any other issues. So if I have a client who is having a difficult time with a recall on a product that is not compliant and so on, then I would work with them to the best of my ability to assist them to become compliant and report on this non-compliance and just get back into whatever proper practice needs to take place. The very clear restriction that does exist is, of course, that if a lawyer in Israel is aware of an ongoing violation that is not being treated properly and is expected to participate, then of course that cannot take place and it's a violation of the ethics code. But in terms of, us interacting and advising clients, and of course our goal is to assist them come into compliance with whatever it is that they are being challenged with at that given time.
An interesting way, extremely interesting way of looking at it. Dan, what about the UK? Anything for law firms specially? Should there be anything for law firms specially? So,
I mean, it's not something I'm really involved in terms of what the requirements of us are in the UK. To my knowledge, that they're fairly light, but I can say that increasingly we face more and more in-depth questions from clients over the years about our sort of diversity and social responsibility initiatives, and increasingly about our environmental practices when we're putting forward pitch proposals. So it's clearly a matter that is in the minds of our prospective clients, of the businesses that we work with, which tend to be sort of fairly large corporates. We've had our own well, we've done pro bono work, had corporate social responsibility initiatives in place for very many years. For the last 5 years, we've had something called our Planet Plus initiative, which includes a zero carbon goal by 2030 and various other objectives around energy usage, paper usage, etc., etc. So it is something that we're very focused on as a business. Within my personal role on the advertising side, I would say, well, the businesses that come to me are looking to promote what they've done in a responsible manner. I'm not approached by businesses who are looking to actively greenwash or to find loopholes in the rules or the regulatory approach which would allow them to misrepresent their environmental impact. I don't know whether it doesn't seem to me likely that those businesses would come to me in the first place. Where I find the challenge is helping businesses to promote the incremental steps they're taking to improve their environmental performance within a regulatory system which is more focused on the end goal. And I was reading something only yesterday about something called greenwashing, which someone had coined to say that, if you're not essentially, if you are slapped down or cancelled every time you try to present an environmental improvement that you've made, well, then perhaps you're going to stop making environmental improvements at all, or stop talking about it, and that will have an impact on choice.
I'm curious who would do the slapping.
So I think whoever was, I forget who was speaking. I think they were talking about the media, about a sort of social media backlash or a media backlash, but you could equally be talking about regulatory action fueling that backlash.
And when you're talking about businesses you work with, do you have any thoughts about, let's say, the associations you join, whether do we want to look at the members of the associations, and do we think we should be going that far?
I think it depends what your brand stands for. So I think you are looking, yes, yeah. I mean, if you stand for nothing more than commercial engaging in commercial transactions on behalf of clients, well, then that's one thing. But I would like to think that our firms stand for something more than that now, that we have brand values, and that those brand values extend to these issues that we're talking about. And where you have brand values and you're publicly associating with businesses or organizations, you're aligning your name with them, well, then I think you do have to look at whether whether that works in line with your brand values. I think you do have to have some level of ethical consideration. I'm not speaking on behalf of the firm here, but that's my personal view. And of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that you would never work with a business which is not environmentally friendly, as my colleagues on the panel have said. There's a difference between working with a business which perhaps needs assistance with compliance, which perhaps is transitioning to a different future, versus one which is playing fast and loose with the rules.
Actually, and if we want to have a feel-good moment now, just take a little advertising break, little commercial break for the World Law Group. When we started the Responsible Business Forum and we started sharing best practices of different firms, so many firms were getting on and doing amazing presentations of the work they're already doing, the policies they have in place. Again, this is more corporate social responsibility than ESG, but we're in the same world of positive things that are going on. And not only did that make us feel good about what we already had as firms, we didn't know that about each one of our firms, we're just in a legal network, But there were some others that didn't really have anything in place yet, that from listening to the other descriptions started taking more active measures in their own firm and creating policies in their own firm to get more involved and to have more of a focus on that. So there was even a growing effect, which we thought, wow, if we've done anything, if we've actually made other law firms more adept and looking at this and adopting policies of their own, that really is nice to say that we've done something here. I'm gonna now, as I said, pivot again. A lot of us do transactions, and in transactions, sometimes in diligence and due diligence, we're seeing environmental things may be coming up. So I'd like to hear a little bit about whether you're seeing ESG or greenwashing coming into the due diligence investigation of companies, whether for a transaction or something else. And Clara, I think it would be great if you start this off.
Thank you, Janet. Well, the first aspect is that I do believe that new legislations regarding human rights and environmental due diligence, they come exactly to avoid companies claiming that they did not know that they were making washing, that they were doing social washing or greenwashing. Because once you're obliged, legally obliged, to look into your supply chain and identifying the negative and positive impacts caused directly and indirectly by your activities, you are indirectly avoiding greenwashing and social washing. So I think this is one aspect, and we've had a very significant increase in these kinds of regulations here in Brazil and Latin America in general. The other issue is the increase of disclosure regulations. So, for instance, publicly held companies here in Brazil are obliged to disclose social and environmental impacts and issues, risks related to social and environmental issues to the market and their shareholders. So I think those kinds of regulations are what we've been having a major change in the legal landscape in Brazil.
All right, Ruth, can you tell us something? What do you see in diligence? What is the play of ESG and greenwashing that you're coming into contact with, or climate risk management issues that companies are now checking in transactions and mergers and acquisitions?
Well, what we've been primarily seeing is significantly more questions on climate risk, climate strategy, and so on. And we have not necessarily been seeing ESG as ESG. This is that the S is, of course, the G is something that's always existed, and it's like a world in and of its own that has not waited for the ESG to arrive. This is something that's been looked at in due diligence for many years. The social, I would say, is less prevalent in Israel in due diligence processes, and is not a major issue that we are seeing, but environment and climate change we are seeing much more, and especially with respect to anything related to climate. Now, again, it always goes back to the question of whether there is any type of potential violation of existing regulations with respect to greenwashing, or any type of concern regarding the development of some sort of class action or a civil lawsuit. So those are the risks that are being looked at when you conduct the legal due diligence for a transaction, and the more I guess the softer issues of how the public is seeing this and so on, that's really outside of the scope of this review and would not be reflected.
And what about supply chain? Are you getting questions about supply chain monitoring yet in diligence?
Yes, we are, and that relates to primarily questions relating to whether within the climate change risk management you would see questions on whether the company has a strategy that only addresses scope 1 and 2 emissions and does not address scope 3, then that would be an issue. There is an expectation, particularly from the larger corporations, to already have some sort of strategy, a transition strategy relating to its value chain, at least within the climate change space. I assume that we will be seeing this reflected in anything related to social aspects as well. This will probably be coming in within the next few years because it's clearly a critical issue that needs to be addressed.
And for those of you who were not at the conference that I heard Ruth speak at last week, scope 3 is the emissions that your suppliers are doing. It's looking at the supply chain emissions. Those of you who don't know that term yet, it's becoming a well-known term in the industry. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to very quickly do a round with the three of you. If you'd all share kind of quickly in under a minute, some experience or insight or something about this whole area that you want to talk about when it comes to the use of ESG or rules against or prevention of greenwashing. And let's start with Dan.
Okay, so mine would be, well, the number one issue that I'm seeing across everything I review and all the complaints that I assist with is absolute claims to be sustainable, green, or kind to the planet, environmentally friendly, that kind of absolute language, because it is really, really difficult to substantiate unqualified claims of that nature. And this is a UK view, but I know that self-regulatory systems around the world are implementing similar rules. The European Union is toughening up the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive to specifically refer to environmental matters. So I think the UK and potentially some other jurisdictions like the Netherlands may be leading on this, but others will follow. And those kind of absolute unqualified claims are high risk.
Great, thanks. Ruth, what is your experience or your insight for us?
Well, I have to say that my insight actually comes from Dan, and he has put a name to my pain by calling it, how did you say, greenwashing?
Greenwashing,
so,
yeah.
Yes. So I loved it because that's the main point. I've experienced a situation with a young climate tech company with an amazing technology that raised $15 million recently. And one of its investors, out of several investors, was Shell, regretfully. So now instead of, congratulating them and hoping they'll do great with their technology, there's huge backlash here in Israel of how come they allowed Shell to be an investor in this clean technology. And this really illustrates the difficulty. It basically means that companies from, so to speak, the old world, or anyone that has historically been engaging with fossil fuels and so on, and they do need to transition, but it takes a long time and it's very difficult. So it's basically they can do no right. They have no right to even try to transition and invest in the cleaner strategies because they'll just be shut down. And that's sort of counterproductive to the general goal of moving forward towards decarbonization.
Thanks. Thank you. Clara.
I think this is a very challenging aspect. I do believe that it is a long path and a long way until companies really can be held accountable for greenwashing, because first they need to know what the impact they're generating in terms of environmental and social aspects. So I think nowadays, currently, if you look closely to any companies, you will find something that they are generating in terms of negative impact, and they're also doing some kind of marketing in terms of positive environmental and social issues. So we've had some cases of clients that are being sued, and what they're saying is that, well, my competitor is doing much worse, and they have the same suppliers. So it's always challenging to show companies that, well, they need to move forward, and if it is fair or not, the time will show. But the fact is, we all need to move forward in terms of knowing our impact and trying to mitigate and reduce the negative impacts, and then do a positive marketing with the positive impact that we are generating.
Lovely. Okay, before you guys leave the room, don't forget, in the chat box, there are some housekeeping issues on sessions coming up and on the Responsible Business Forum. You can look at the chat before you leave. We did have a comment from someone in the audience saying show is trying to hitch its wagon to a star. It's a nice way to end today. Huge thanks to Dan, to Ruth, to Clara on joining us today. I hope you all enjoyed this.